All right, we have with us this morning Dr. Terence Robinson. He is with Cornell University. He is known nationally and internationally for his expertise in tree training and good quality fruit production. So without further ado, Terence, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll hear some more about this tall spindle.
It's really great to be here and talk a little bit about how to stay in the apple business, how to make money, where the opportunities are for the future. Wayne, I'd say you picked up a lot on your trips, and it really, to me, is one of the ways that you can help move forward in the apple business and stay profitable. I think it's the most important way. Now, you mentioned some varieties that maybe aren't the traditional varieties for this area. That's a decision each one of you have to make, where you see the opportunities in the variety question. It might be some of the ones you've planted, it might be others. But that is the key decision you have to make when you plant a new orchard. And so I'm really gratified to see that you stepped out on a limb a little bit, try some new things. When you go to make investments in new orchards and you plant a high density orchard with a high investment for a variety that's going to return a relatively low price, there's very little opportunity to make money because you spend a lot of money. And the prices are only modest. So you've got to invest in varieties that are going to hopefully bring a little bit higher price. And that's a decision that each one of you has to make. I really appreciated Mike Parker's presentation yesterday. I think that's a role for the university people, a role for Marvin, to try to help you identify those opportunities. Now, for us in New York, this variety, Honeycrisp, has been one of the great opportunities. Now, I'm not saying that's the variety for you here, that's for you guys to decide. But once you make that decision that you're going to be in the apple business and you're going to try to modernize, plant new varieties, plant varieties where you see an opportunity, whether it's in your roadside market, pick your own, or whether it's in the wholesale market, then this decision becomes the most critical next decision. That is, how to plant the trees, what rootstock to plant them on. And our analysis of the economic situation is that you should go higher density than the traditional orchard, that it's a density that seems like it's unreasonable at the beginning, but after you get used to it, it's relatively simple. And I think you'll see here on these trees that it's a relatively simple system. And I think if you, after the presentation today and discussion, you'll come away thinking, Wayne, you could have gone a little bit closer on these and be both in the row and between the row. But that's the first step. And as you take that first step, you get comfortable with this, you take the next step, pretty much you end up where quite a few people around the world are ending up. And we could go even closer than where we're planting, which is about 3 feet by 12. We could go down to 2 feet by 10, or some people even closer. But we don't seem to make more money. And I want to emphasize, the whole point of doing this is to maximize your potential for profitability. So there's no reason to invest more money if you're not going to make any more money. And that's the reason why we sort of have limited the density to somewhere around 1,000 trees to the acre. Now, those of you that heard my presentation yesterday heard the long version of that. We're just going to discuss the short version today and maybe draw a couple of pictures on this whiteboard and then do some pruning and talk about the tree structure. We have spent a lot of years looking at different densities and different training systems, and we've kind of ended up on this system we call the tall spindle. I think it's broadly applicable. I think almost every grower in the U.S. can plant this system and can be successful at it. It's based on relatively simple concepts. It's very sound horticulturally. It works on almost every variety. There's some small differences when we go to tip-bearing varieties, but it still works. But most importantly, it produces very high yields and it gives you the opportunity to have the most profit. Now, the tree density that we like the best is around 1,000 trees to the acre. That's somewhere 3 by 12. It can be up to 4 by 14. Although once you get to 14, what was the row spacing here, Wayne? Once you get to 14, it sounds good if you used to be at 20, but after you see some of the things we're going to do on pruning and see the concepts of how narrow the trees are, you start thinking, boy, I could drive a full-size pickup down there once we're done. And you start to think maybe 12 would have been better. So this is a discussion I've had all over the world. In meters, it turns out to be lots of people are at 4 meters, that's 13.1 feet, and I try to get them down to 3.5 meters outside the US. Here it's to go from 14 to 12. That's because the tree that we're trying to develop is based on relatively small diameter branches that don't extend out into the tractor alley so far. So when you look down this row, you see some branches starting to extend out, and people start to say, hey, I'm glad that I have 14 feet because my tractor is barely going to fit. But now imagine looking down that row and not having that branch sticking out, having only smaller diameter branches. Then you can start to see how 12 feet really, really works well. Let me just draw a little bit of a diagram of the tree that we're after. There's several small but very critical steps to this type of orchard. And the first is getting the right kind of tree. Historically, we have accepted a 5/8 caliper whip with no side branches. And that type of tree works, but it's not the ideal tree. What we would prefer is to have a 5/8 caliper tree that has 8 to 10 feathers. Now that's quite a few, but it's possible. We have quite a few of the nurseries now producing that. They had this product called Tiburon they could spray in the nursery, and it gave beautiful trees for about 4 years. Now we've lost it because the company chose not to make it anymore because the nursery business is so small that they didn't make any money. So now we've spent some last 3 years doing some work in both New York, and this year we did work in Washington nurseries, Ontario, Canada, Pennsylvania, and New York nurseries, with other techniques which primarily revolve around Promelin or Maxell to get highly feathered trees. And there's some pretty good trees that are coming out. But hopefully what we get is a tree that has no side branches from the graft union up to about 24 inches. So when you get a tree from the nursery, hopefully they've already taken off all the branches below 24 inches. Unfortunately, some nurseries still want to stick down at 15 inches, and they send you lots of branches between 15 inches and 24 inches, which are of no use to us. So ask them, I don't want any branches below 24 inches. Above 24 inches, if we can get 10 relatively flat but relatively short side branches, that's ideal. Now, the second important point is this small little detail of the distance between the graft union and the ground. This is a simple thing, but historically we don't pay enough attention to it, and I just was glancing a little bit, not to be any sort of critic about anything, but that's one of the things that you possibly could spend a little more effort here is getting those graft unions up. We like to have them at least 4 inches up to 6 inches above ground. Now that becomes critical as the trees get older. Once they're 15 years old and they're planted relatively deep right at the ground unit and some get scion rooted, then you're battling that tree. What we're looking for is an orchard that's going to be easy to manage for 20 years, not one that we're going to have to really, really work at, and color's going to go down and vigor is going to take over. And that happens when the graft union is planted too low. I teach a little technique, and if I was here for planting season, I'd teach you my little strategy. I personally walk behind the planter. I grab every tree, pull it up to the right union, and then I put 1 foot and the second foot. I tell people you have to weigh more than 200 pounds to do this job because you need a 200 pounds and 200 pounds and it's perfect. I think I qualify, right? But I bring it up to 4 to 6 inches. I set that height at the time of planting, and we check it the next day. Every tree has to be up. And that helps avoid this little problem later. So we're going to just sort of draw a little wavy line and say that's where the tree was when we got it from the nursery. It had 8 to 10 feathers. Soon after planting, if the feathers are relatively long, and generally the nurseries are sending us trees that have too long of feathers for my taste. If we don't do anything with those feathers, they tend to start to grow and become a scaffold branch. And you'll see that in this system, scaffold branches are no good. Now right here on the first tree behind the scaffold board is a scaffold branch. And I'm going to cut that out in just a minute. It's just too big. And so what we would love to do is to keep these branches that come from the nursery as small branches, not let them become scaffold branches. And the best way to do that is to tie them down below horizontal. So this branch that was at that angle, if I tie it in this direction, and this one, and maybe about 4 or 5 of them, of the bigger ones, I tie down, they don't grow very much that first year, but they spur up. And then they produce some crop in the second year, and in the third year, and in the fourth year. If I leave them up, like this one right behind us, it generally gets pretty big, especially these bottom 2 or 3, by year 4. Then I have to cut them out. So I maybe got a little bit of crop on them in the third year, but I really couldn't keep them very long. Hence, this strategy of bending branches down, and we'll talk about that in a minute, allows me to keep these lower branches for 5, 6 years, maybe longer. I produce a number of apples on them, and they really help us get this orchard into production quick. So that's the first point. Now the second point is, we have the tradition to do some tipping at planting. Now this is a horticultural fallacy. Every one of you believes that if you head a tree at planting, it's going to grow more, become bigger, because we have the mistaken notion that that pruning will make the trees grow bigger. But the horticultural reality is pruning is a dwarfing process, and every time we cut a tree, it ends up smaller than it would have been in this fashion. This is the tree as we got it from the nursery. If I head it down, it's going to grow vigorously up to here. But the reality is, if I didn't head it, it might grow less vigorously, but it still ends up taller. It always ends up shorter than it would have been if you head the tree. Now that can get complicated a couple of years down the road if this all spurs up and then there's just so much fruit that we get no growth. So you have the compounding effect of crop load later. But in that first year, you'll always get more growth, or you'll end up with a taller tree if you don't head it. Hence, the biggest change we've made in managing new trees is we don't head them anymore. We don't head them no matter what. 6 feet tall trees, we don't head them. I've seen some trees that are as tall as I can reach. We don't head them. We keep them that entire length, because the goal is to get this tree as quickly as possible to the 10 to 11 feet height. And I'd like to do that in just 2 seasons. Now this is where it becomes critical, the type of tree. If you accept a tree that's 3/8 inch, or even a 1/2 inch tree, or 7/16 inch tree, all of those generally are shorter. They're about 4 feet to 5 feet. Then you have to start from this position down here to get up to the 10, 11 feet. But if you buy a 5/8 inch tree, generally they're close to 6 feet, 5.5 to 6 feet. Let's just say it's 6 feet. If the first year I can grow 2 feet, that puts me at 8. If the next year I can grow 3 feet, which generally happens, we grow a little bit less the first year because of transplant shock, and the second year the roots are established, we can grow a little more. There's my 11 feet. 6 plus 2 plus 3, I'm at 11 feet at the end of the second year. That's the goal. So every one of you in your new orchards, I'd like to see you try to get that. We'll put the wire up about 9.5 feet, 10 feet like this one, and pass it a foot by the end of the second year. Now Wayne, Honeycrisp is the worst variety to stand in front of and do that because it's very slow growing, very difficult to achieve that. But Gala, you can do it. Fuji, you can do it. Goldens, you can do it. So that's the first big change that we've made in managing trees, is we don't head them. So I've made several little points. So buy good trees. Number 2, plant the graft union 4 to 6 inches out. Number 3,
and that's 5/8 inch you're talking about.
it's 5/8 inch feathered. Number 3, do not head the tree head leader or the feathers. So often people want to head these feathers. That tends to stiffen them up in that position. If you leave them long, they can be bent down, like I said, and then they'll produce spurs and have very nice fruit in the second year. So bend or tie down feathers. Yeah, well, you got a couple months. We generally try to get it done in the first month. Now that's a very interesting little point that you just raised in my mind, is how some growers just seem to be organized enough. And I hold up in particular case the Fowler brothers or Vanderwalls from New York, who are people that we work with. Sometimes they plant in the fall if they can, but if they plant in the spring, those guys have the ability to not only be spraying, the Fowlers have about 4,000 acres, so they're huge. They have the ability to spray and do everything they do on mature orchards, but they can plant, build trellis, install irrigation, and get the tree clipped to the trellis all within 1 month after planting. They just have the ability to organize themselves to get that all done. And that's another key thing. Let's get this stuff done soon. And so this tying down of branches happens in the perfect case within a month after harvest, or a month after planting. The reason being that if you allow the branch to grow too much in the upright position, it tends to grow too much. And we don't want it to grow too much. If we plant at the 3-foot spacing that I'm going to suggest for you, the branches come from the nursery almost long enough. They almost touch the next tree. So all we need to do is just spur them up and start cropping. Last point, grow 24 inches the first year. That's not an unreasonable task. Some people are going to do better than that. So if you start with that orchard and you do it in this very simple manner, there's a little bit of work the first year. You got to build trellis. You got to get the tree tied to the trellis. You got to tie branches down. But then it's a matter of pushing them with fertilizer and water, and then just standing back for the next couple of years and letting the tree grow. Comes into cropping because of these very precocious rootstocks, and all of a sudden, man, you're into production, you're into some high yields without doing much else. So that's a very simple recipe that leads you to have this very, very high yielding orchard very quick. Now, some of you that weren't there yesterday might not have heard my challenge. It's possible in New York to achieve high yields in the second, third, and fourth year. It's even more possible in North Carolina. You guys have better growing conditions, better summer, longer summer, that can grow better and bigger trees. So I've set this goal for our growers in New York to produce relatively high second year yields, 200 to 300 bushels in the second year, 500 to 600 in the third year, 900 in the fourth year, and more than 1,000 in the fifth year. That adds up to a total of 3,000 total bushels over the first 5 years. And I made the offer. Any one of you that can prove that you've done that will buy you a steak dinner, Marvin and I. Because really, I should reverse that. You'll be so wealthy, you'll buy us a steak dinner. And if you accept a lower quality tree, and I don't like that, but I know the reality. Not every nursery can produce the trees, and we sometimes take advantage of bargains and accept whips or medium caliper whips. It does push it back 1 year. But you're not going to collect on your steak dinner by going 6 years for this. It's really the whip. So let's say you bought a 4-inch or 4-foot tall whip. Let's say it's 1/2 inch. Seems pretty common. It's not a terrible tree. But it didn't come with any of the branches we want. So you have an additional task, and that is to grow branches on the portion of that that's above 24 inches. So on that portion there, we have to somehow induce branching, and there's a couple of very simple techniques, and I talked about it yesterday. But what we end up doing is spraying that portion of the tree with a growth regulator. Well, no, I like the most is Maxell, but Promelin also works. We wait till about 20 days after planting. And we come through with this little backpack sprayer and spray from 24 inches to the tip. But we don't head the tree. So with the same rule applies as before. We're not going to head that tree. Even if that tree was a 6-foot tall whip, I won't head it. but then I spray from 24 inches to the tip. Steve was telling me that he's done a paint roller thing. That also works. I've seen that. Some people actually use a glove and they dip their, well, they mix the chemical in white paint, let's say, latex paint. They dip a glove and then they just take their hand soaked in paint and Maxell up that liter. Some people say, I don't want to get off the tractor, and they just ride down the row and spray it, even though it takes a lot more chemical because there's just little sticks out there and you're spraying that product. But in the final analysis, a couple of jugs of Maxell is not the big money deal. But it's tremendously valuable to induce these buds that came from the nursery to pop out. Now this timing could be refined, and I think I'm going to ask Steve if he would take the responsibility to refine this timing because I'm running out of energy. It's just sort of we haven't tested more timings, but the idea is this. When you plant a tree, you got to let it go about a week to wake up. And so I like to let the tree wake up and let a little bit of movement of reserve start to move from the roots and the wood into those buds. So after about 20 days, the buds are out a little bit. At that point is when I think these lateral buds can respond best to either Maxell or Promelin. And then it just pops them out. We use about 500 parts per million. In New York, I've tested 500 and 1,000. So let's just say up to 1,000. Steve was telling me he's tested even higher to 1,500. Yes?
You're assuming all this to be spring planting, is that correct?
This is for spring planting. If you did fall planting, then you would wait till I'd say about 10 days after bud break. So I want about 10 days after the buds start to push to put this out. Now I'm sure it probably works better in warmer conditions. We haven't spent that much time testing it. We have tried a lot of varieties, and some varieties are more responsive than others. But this is a way to plant a whip and then get a really nice orchard out of it. A really nice feathered tree without heading. Now I hate to tell you this next comment because you'll all do what every grower that I ever tell this to does. The 5/8 feathered tree is going to cost you $7.50 to $8. You can sometimes get this tree for $5. You can still make a nice orchard out of it. You're 1 year delayed. So what do the vast majority of guys want to do? They want to buy the cheaper tree because it's so expensive to plant one of these orchards. I acknowledge that, but I want to try to convince you to invest the money in a high quality tree, even if it costs more money. Let's put the price at $8. And let's say you're planting 1,000. We're putting in the ground $8,000 in trees. We got to build a trellis, but we're not going to count that because we got to build the trellis either way. But let's suppose we have the $5 tree and we can still plant in 1,000, that's $5,000 per acre. So the $3,000 difference, that's a lot of money. For every acre you're going to plant, you want to plant 20 acres? You're talking some real money. But let's go down the line. Let's suppose in the second year we can get 200 bushels to the acre, 500 in the third, 800 in the fourth, we'll put 1,000, this is lower than my targets, in the fifth. What does that add up to quick, Marvin? Or Steve McCartney or Mike?
10, 18.
25? 25?
Yep.
Okay, let's take this whip. We're going to be 1 year delayed. In the second year, we're going to have 0. The third year, we're going to have 200, 500, and 800. What does that add up? 1,500. Okay, we've got 1,000 bushels of difference. How much are you going to give me for each bushel of fruit I produce? It's a high-priced new variety. It's not the Rome's. We can make it easy. $10 is an easy way to figure it. So I got 1,000 times $10 per bushel. I got $10,000 difference. But I invested $3,000 to get it. So there's money to be made. Now, in our particular case, $20 for Honeycrisp per bushel is very, very almost easy to do. So that's why we continue to push these high-quality feathered trees, because there's substantial amount of money to be made if you can start them into production right off the bat. I repeat, North Carolina should do this easier than New York. You have a better climate here, just more heat units. So that kind of answers your question about whip trees, the way I'd manage them. Any other questions or comments? Excellent question. What about this replant disease problem? We're going back in, this was Rome's before, wasn't it? So you've got that problem. It's always a problem. And so we have to try to avoid this problem of trees not growing in the first and second year. I've said you've got to grow the tree in 2 years. Now let me go back just a page. In this particular example of the feathered tree, I want to grow the 2 feet that first year. Suppose I only grow 6 inches because of replant disease. The problem is that these rootstocks, M9 or M26 or some of the new Geneva, are so precocious they start to flower. So then you're stuck with this decision, this dilemma. I'm in the second leaf, I'm starting the second leaf, there's a lot of flowers on the tree, but they only grew 6 inches last year because of replant disease. What do I do? Definitely, you got to start throwing some fertilizer at them. But do I leave those blossoms on there and crop them, or do I take them off? You got to take them off because the trees didn't grow. So then you lose, well, you got to go back now. You lose my 200 bushels in the second leaf. So we lose this. Suppose then they grow 1.5 feet the next year. So I got to go back, Marvin. I only grew 6 inches, then I grew 1.5 feet. So by the end of the second year, I'm at 7, 8 feet instead of my 10, 11 feet. But the tree's already settling down, it's already going into the cropping mode, and it's almost going to quit growing. That's the worst problem of all. That's why if you only grow 6 inches the first year, you're better off to take that fruit off, really try to recover, push them with nitrogen and water to get the tree to grow. But we have to go back and ask, what could we have done differently to help us with this replant problem? That's really the problem. And there's really 2 approaches. One is to come in and fumigate. There's still a lot of fumigation done in some parts of the world, but not so much in New York. Mostly we've given it up for 2 reasons. One, we can't get anybody to do it anymore. Secondly, the problem is very variable. Some people have no replant problem and others have big replant problems. So the second approach has been to find rootstocks that are more tolerant to replant disease. And this is where there's great news from the Geneva rootstocks. Several of the Geneva rootstocks tend to have some resistance to apple replant disease. Now, I was just invited to Italy in November to the big Interpoma meeting there, and that was their main question. In this northern part of Italy, it's all small farms. Everybody has, 3 to 5 acres, and there's no new land. Plus, you could sell your land, but it's valued at $200,000 a hectare to $500,000 a hectare. So it basically never changes hands. It stays in your family, you can't subdivide it, so you got to pick your favorite child to pass it on to. The other children are out of luck. But it stays in apples, and you got to go back and back and back. And their major question is, what rootstocks can we use to get away from this replant disease? And the answer that I gave them is there's several that have relatively good tolerance. Now, we've got about 8 studies so far worldwide. Mike cited one of them yesterday, 2 of them yesterday. And I would say this, they're variable. Some studies show one rootstock really tolerant, other studies show another one really tolerant. And I think it varies because our methodology is not perfect, and secondly, the organisms vary. But overall, the ones that seem quite tolerant to replant disease are G41, G30, G210, G935, and the brand new one, which you can't get yet, which I'm still going to put up here, is G214. So my answer to that, whoever asked the question, is try to get one of these rootstocks if you're going back into replant ground. They won't be perfect because our data shows that you can even improve the production of these by fumigating because there's still some effects of these organisms in the soil on the growth of the trees. But you'll get more than 6 inches of growth. You'll get that 2 feet of growth the first year, 3 the next year, and you get to the top wire and you can follow this plan of trying to get these early yields and get the tree up. So these are available at the moment. I've just done a data collection from all the nurseries in the US that produce these stocks, and I'm really positively shocked because there's been a mini boom in planting of stool beds for these stocks. And so everybody here is going to say, I've tried to order them, but I can't get them. And it's been a challenge for us to even get these things launched commercially. But this winter, starting in November, going through right now, there have been 2 million of these rootstocks of those 4 harvested in the US. That's unbelievable. I thought there'd be 200,000 or 300,000. But they've planted a lot of stool bed, and this is the first year it's kicking in. Next year it's going to go higher. So you should be able to get your name on a list to get some of these stocks if you're going into replant ground. These are the best three at the moment for high density. Now there's one other one that I didn't put on the list because its data is variable, and that's the one, this is the one that's most available right now. This one and 41, each were produced in about $600,000 liners this right now. Those go into the nursery next spring in 13 that we're in, finished trees in 14, so they'll be ready for you to plant in 15. Now G11 is an interesting case, and Mike would be interested in this. I looked at all the studies. 3 of the studies show this is resistant. 4 of the studies show it's not resistant. What do you do with that? So there's a plant pathologist in Washington State that works for USDA that has shown that this particular one is very tolerant of nematodes, but maybe it's not so tolerant of some of the other fungal problems in the soil. So in some cases where nematodes are the problem, G11 would be a great choice. In other places it's not. But nevertheless, it is a fabulous rootstock for high density orchards for Fuji. It really does a tremendous job. It's the most dwarfing. It's really the most like M9 of any of them that we have. I just wanted to put this number up there just to say, start pushing. If you need these, get the nurseries to give you your share. I'm going to put the rootstock there most like. So a couple of these are more in the semi-dwarf category, G30 and G210. They're more like M26 or slightly bigger than M26. But the other ones are all M9 size. It's just that like 41 and 935 are more like a big M9, what we call a NIC 29, whereas G11 is more like a smaller M9, like a 337. The reality is, I can make every one of those work in a high density orchard. For example, with Honeycrisp, it's a wheat growing tree. I'd love to plant it on this, even on this one, because I need a little more push. But my method, not mine, the method of bending branches down, inducing cropping, and then removing big branches as they appear allows you to make any one of these work in a high density situation. They all have the advantage that they're precocious. The problem with M7 when you try to make it work in high density, it's not precocious, and it doesn't partition resources into fruit, it partitions it into wood, and so we get a lot of impetus to grow. All of these, once you start them cropping, and you crop them heavy, they just want to crop. And so they're quite different than trying to do high density with M7 or with 111. So I can make every one of them work. The word comes from the word column. Columnarize.
Columnate exists.
Columnate?
Exists, that's when you take life and you make it.
So columnarize should exist too.
It does now.
Yes, it does.
Life.
But a better word that a lot of people like is the word simplify. But it's a simple concept, and we're going to demonstrate it here on the trees behind us, and that is to make the branch, cut off side branches on any branch that exists in the tree so it has only a single axis. So it's just one single column of spurs. That's where I get the word columnarize. A single column of spurs. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a minute with the trees. But it's really the next step. Now, what I've tried to do so far is just draw on paper some idea, give you a vision about how to plant an orchard. My main goal is to get those of you that are still on the fence or afraid that things are going to go really, really wrong and that you'll lose your shirt economically to feel more comfortable with these ideas. It's relatively simple to do. I said it's like falling out of bed. You just do these steps, and lo and behold, 4 years down the road, you got this beautiful orchard. But after year 5, you have to be on a process of renewing limbs to keep this orchard beautiful for the next 15, maybe 20 years. This is also a relatively simple thing, but it's one that is sometimes difficult for growers to grab a hold of. Now, are those your trees over there across that, the older trees? So the difference between those older trees and these trees is the concept of permanent branches. We've all grown up with the Don Heineke idea of growing tiers of branches, and then once we have those made, we basically try to prune up each branch every year, cut off the uprights, cut it back if we need to, keep it a cone shape, but never take out the branch. The branch is a permanent part of the structure of the tree. So the idea was, in the old days, grow the structure of the tree and then hang fruiting spurs on it, and then we don't have to put up a trellis, the branches are strong. This is a different concept. The only permanent part of the tree is that trunk. And so the concept in your mind of taking out a whole branch has to be something you learn to accept and learn to understand and learn to practice. Because these systems will just quickly become problems if you leave big branches in the upper part of the tree. I walk into blocks and the top of the tree is overgrown, the bottom of the tree, there's so much shading in the bottom, there's little fruit, and it's kind of gone wild. Now, it's not likely to happen on Honeycrisp, but it can happen quickly on Fuji. It can happen quickly on Gala or some of the other more vigorous varieties, Jonagold. So starting in year 5, the concept has to be limb renewal pruning. Let's just stay here. Yeah. So in this particular concept, what we try to do is grow branches, make them as useful as we can, really productive, until they get beyond a certain size, and then cut them out completely and try to regrow a new shoot that can become a replacement branch. And this renewal pruning is done by cutting the branch off close to the trunk, but leaving a little stub. That little stub has some latent buds in it that often will grow a new shoot. Now, as I've tried to teach this over the years, I run into the concept that that limb that you're cutting off, Mr. Robinson, had half a bushel of apples on it, and I need those apples, especially if it's Honeycrisp. People think it's too expensive, I can't cut off a single apple. So I've tried to develop arguments against that over the years. And my latest version of this is to try to argue that we have so many trees per acre that we only need X number of apples on each tree. Therefore, we've got way too many buds. Taking out that limb is just a way to do some pre-thinning of the tree. So we don't have to do so much chemical thinning to get the crop load down a little bit with the pruning shears. If you come to our meeting in New York, and Marvin's slots are filling up pretty quick, the 10 slots that I told you yesterday, you're going to learn about this concept of precision thinning, which basically says, and I learned, somebody here's, who told me last night? I already forgot.
Stephen?
Yeah, Stephen is doing this already, so you don't have to come to the school. But the argument for limb renewal pruning is based on this. I'm going to say that I planted 3 by 12 because I already know those numbers. That's around 1,000 trees to the acre. If I want to have a 1,500 bushel crop, and on a mature tree, because we're talking now mature trees, we've left the young tree stuff, and I want 100 count in every bushel, I want 100 apples in every bushel, that's basically 150,000, is that right? 1.5 million, I think, apples to the acre. But I have 1,000 trees to the acre. No, it's 150,000, one too many zeros. I got 1,000, so I can cross off 3 zeros. I only need 150 apples on every tree. Can somebody quickly count how many buds are on these Honeycrisp trees? Just count one tree for me. 40, 50, 300. I think there's 300 flower clusters on those trees before you prune them. Now, how many flowers are in each cluster? On average, 5. So we got 1,500 potential apples on that tree. If I cut off that one limb that's sticking out there that really bugs me, how many are you going to lose, Wayne? Okay, we'll lose 100. I'm down to 1,400, but I got to get down to 150. I've still got 10 times as many apples on that tree as I can really carry. Now, unfortunately, you don't have 3 by 12, because if you did, you'd have gotten a gold star, but you're close. So you're going to need more than 150 apples. Let's say you need 200 apples, but still, we got 1,400 to start with. Even if you need 300 apples on those trees, you've got to do a lot of thinning to get it down. Plus, you're worried about biennial bearing on Honeycrisp. So the point is, by taking out one limb or 2 limbs each year, we still almost always, in 99% of the cases, have many more flower buds than we really need on those trees. So we have come up with what we call the 2-cut rule. You can cut out 1 or 2 branches every year without affecting yield. Now, we did a study early on, and it was on bigger trees. I wish I should repeat it on these size trees, where we cut out 1 limb, 2 limbs, 3 limbs, and 4 limbs. When we got up to 4 limbs, often yield was reduced. But either 1 or 2 limbs, we never impacted yield, because we always still had way more many flowering spurs than what we needed. So that led us to this concept. Let's take out 1 limb or 2 limbs each year, and if we do it every year, we can keep the trees based on small diameter limbs, and always eliminate the biggest ones, which will never give us a tree with big branches. It'll never give us that central leader style of tree we have across the road. And that's the whole idea behind it. So simple. But until you do it yourself, you're afraid of it sometimes, and people are worried that the thing's going to get away from me. I'm going to not be able to control it. And I said yesterday the story that always happens to me, and I'm so glad you didn't do it to me today, Wayne. They take me into that style tree and say, oh, I'm glad I didn't plant these at 3 feet like you say, because look how big the dang thing got. It got big because first of all, on different rootstock, but even if it was on M9 and it got big because we allowed it to grow big. We allowed big branches to grow, and we can manage it differently in this system. Okay, Marvin was reminding me about my fingers analogy, and Bob, this is where I thought I was so clear about this columnarizing word. It worked well in Spanish. Maybe I should, where you talk about a branch developing side branches, and they're not exactly like fingers, but they're fingers all the way up and down your arm. Those are the side branches on any sort of scaffold branch. I don't like scaffold branch, but let's just say fruiting branch. What I want to do with columnarizing is take off all the side branches or take off all the fingers. And that was the only part we were trying to make with that fingers analogy yesterday, but we've already explained that here with this simplify the branch or columnarize. Now we're going to do it here on some real trees, make it a little easier to talk about. Let's go to a tree. Any questions before we move to the real trees? The question is, over the years, over the last 50 years, we've been taught that a triangle, conic shaped, Christmas tree shaped tree gives the best light distribution. It is true that if the top is narrow, that it doesn't block light reaching the bottom of the tree. But it's also true that if the bottom is too wide, wider than about 3 feet, and that's the problem we get in on the central leader trees, even though we maintain a Christmas tree shape, the bottom is still so wide we can't get light to penetrate more than about 3 feet. So to solve that problem, and you go to central leader trees, you'll see many times in the bottom in the center, even though their Christmas tree shape is not very good. To get away from that, we've tried to just narrow up the entire canopy. So these trees are going to be based on a relatively narrow top, which is only about 2 feet wide at maturity, and possibly 3 feet wide at the base, but often it ends up much more straight. But we still attempt to maintain a little bit of a Christmas tree shape, but the whole idea is to keep it all narrow, not wider than 3 feet any place on that tree to get light penetration all the way to the center. The question is, does the compass direction of the rows make any difference on the performance of the trees? And the answer is yes, but you sometimes are forced by the slope of the land to plant in a different direction. Always, north-south gives you the best light distribution on both sides of the tree. Anytime you turn 90 degrees and plant east-west, the north side of that tree is always more shaded than the south side of the tree. The answer to that is if you have to go east-west because of the topography, the thinner you can make the canopy, the better. The north side is less heavily shaded. And hence, these systems work better on an east-west than do a big central leader tree on an east-west. But even better yet is to plant north-south wherever possible. The question is, when you get a mistake from the nursery with the wrong rootstock, it is really a problem. And if it's just a few pollinizer trees, I'd rip them out and or rip some out and start over again, because they're a problem. You'll see that after the orchard's 20 years old, those guys will just be real big challenges for you. It's so much easier to do when you have a rootstock helping you. Now, there was a time 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, where we thought apogee would solve that. We could do anything with apogee. But the genetics of the rootstock help you every single year of the 20 or 25 year life of that orchard. And that's why it's so critical to get the right rootstock. So I'll prune some. It's not the end of the world.
This has been a production of BRCC TV, the education channel, in conjunction with the North Carolina Cooperative Extension, empowering people, providing solutions.